You are standing in chains before a temple so vast it seems to swallow the horizon. 2 weeks ago, you wore silver in your braids. 2 weeks ago, your name meant something. Now your wrists are raw from rope, your daughter's hand trembles in yours, and a man whose words sound like stones grinding together is speaking your new identity into existence. Henatah, he says. Lady of the two lands, the cruelty of it steals your breath. They will call you mistress of the very kingdom that turned your world to ash. Your husband's body lies somewhere in the western sand, unmarked, unmourned, and you are being reborn as Egyptian. Before we go any further, I need to say this still amazes me that a story carved in stone over 3,000 years ago can reach someone watching on a screen halfway across the world. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd genuinely love to know. This wasn't mythology. This wasn't exaggeration for dramatic effect. What you're about to hear is documented on temple walls that tourists photograph every day without understanding what they're looking at. Recorded in administrative papyri that tracked human beings with the same bureaucratic precision as grain shipments. Depicted in relief carvings that show exactly what Pharaoh Ramesses III did to the wives and daughters of his enemies. This is what the evidence confirms. And this is why geneticists today still find traces of these women in modern Egyptian DNA. Why archaeologists uncover burials that blend cultures never meant to mix. Why certain traditions in Egypt's western regions feel older than Egypt itself. The year was 1181 BCE. The Bronze Age world was collapsing like a cliff face, crumbling into the sea. The Hittite Empire, once Egypt's greatest rival, had already fallen. Assyrian Greece was burning. Trade routes that had sustained civilizations for centuries were severed. Cities across the eastern Mediterranean were being abandoned so quickly that meals were left on tables still visible in the archaeological record. And from the west, from the increasingly harsh Sahara, a massive Libyan confederation was moving toward the Nile Delta. Not raiders looking for plunder. Entire tribes' warriors, yes, but also their wives, their children, their elderly, their livestock, everything they owned, loaded onto carts and carried on backs. This was desperation wearing the mask of invasion, an exodus driven by ecological collapse as the desert consumed their ancestral grazing lands. Ramesses III, Egypt's aging pharaoh, met them somewhere in the western delta with the most professional military force in the known world. Egyptian composite bows that could kill at distances Libyan warriors couldn't comprehend. Bronze-tipped arrows by the tens of thousands. Chariot divisions that moved with practiced coordination. A command structure refined through generations of conquest. The battle was brutal and lasted days. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu claim 12,000 Libyan men fell. The number might be propaganda inflated for political effect, but the scale of the catastrophe was undeniably real. And then came the part that transformed military victory into something far more calculated, far more permanent. The Egyptian soldiers didn't just defeat the army and return home. They swept through the Libyan camp and captured everyone who had survived and couldn't run fast. Enough, wives, daughters, children, the elderly, anyone breathing. The temple reliefs show them in long columns, bound at the wrists, ropes connecting them like beads on a string. One scene shows a woman carrying an infant, while a rope around her neck ties her to a dozen others. Another shows girls who look no older than 12 or 13, their eyes carved wide in eternal stone, frozen in the moment their world ended. The hieroglyphic inscription running above these figures is chillingly bureaucratic in its precision. The vile chief of the Libu, overthrown and captured, along with his wives, his children, and all his people, brought as living captives to fill the workshops of His Majesty and to people the temples of his Father. Amen. Fill the workshops. People the temples. They were describing human beings as resources to be allocated, labor to be distributed, property belonging to Egypt's gods. The march to Thebes took weeks. 300 miles through scorching desert with minimal water, minimal food, maximum calculated suffering. This wasn't just transportation. This was psychological warfare designed to break them so thoroughly that by the time they reached Egypt's capital, resistance would seem impossible. Some didn't make it, children too young to maintain the pace, elderly who collapsed from heat and dehydration. The administrative records that meticulously count arrivals don't account for everyone who left. You can draw your own conclusions about what happened to those who fell behind. Imagine being that woman from the opening, the one I'm calling Henetai, because we need a name, even though the scrolls only recorded her as a category in an inventory. Your husband is dead. You watched Egyptian soldiers sever his hands as trophies. A practice documented in multiple temple reliefs showing scribes tallying piles of severed hands like harvest yields. Your daughter walks beside you, 13 years old, bound by the same rope that binds you. You speak perhaps a dozen words of Egyptian. You have no idea where you're being taken or what will happen when you arrive. You only know that every step carries you farther from everything that ever made sense. When they reached Thebes, the first destination was Karnak Temple for what the Egyptians called the presentation ceremony. This was theater orchestrated on a staggering scale. The captives were paraded through massive courtyards where Egyptian nobility, foreign ambassadors, merchants, and hundreds of priests gathered to witness the demonstration of Egypt's power. Incense smoke, thick enough to taste. Ritual chanting echoing off stone columns. Scribes recording numbers with administrative precision. And Ramesses III standing before the sanctuary of Ammon, formally offering the captives as tribute to the god who had granted him victory. This served multiple purposes simultaneously. Religious ritual thanking Amen with a portion of the spoils. Political propaganda showing Egypt's elite that their aging pharaoh could still successfully defend the realm. And psychological warfare aimed at foreign observers who would carry reports back to their rulers. Egypt doesn't just defeat you, it absorbs you, transforms you, erases you. After the ceremony came the sorting. Egyptian administrators had centuries of institutional experience with this process. They evaluated captives based on age, physical condition, apparent skills, and potential usefulness. The elderly and very young children who couldn't perform effective labor the records go conspicuously silent about their fate. Healthy adult women were categorized as agricultural workers, craft workers, or household servants. And young women, particularly those who appeared to be from noble families based on their bearing, clothing remnants, or the desperate way their mothers tried to shield them, they were marked for assignment to the Canaret. The word Canaret needs careful translation because it carries modern connotations that don't perfectly align with ancient, screamy Egyptian reality. The term referred to residential quarters where royal women, concubines, female servants, and children associated with the king lived and worked. These weren't just pleasure palaces in the way popular imagination might assume. They were complex institutions, workshops producing fine textiles and luxury goods that generated significant revenue, administrative offices managing vast agricultural estates, residential areas housing hundreds of people. But they also functioned as sites of what we would now unambiguously call systematic sexual exploitation, framed through religious ideology that treated the pharaoh's sexuality as an expression of divine power that maintained cosmic order. Underneath all the ideological framing, the reality was brutally simple. Women assigned to the Canaret had no autonomy, no ability to refuse, no legal recourse if they were abused. And refusing was never even presented as a possibility. Henetai and her daughter were assigned to the Canaret attached to Ramesses III's massive mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. When they arrived, they underwent a transformation process explicitly designed to strip away their Libyan identity and reconstruct them as Egyptians or, at least as Egyptian property. First, their clothing was removed. The distinctive patterned textiles that marked their tribal affiliation. The leather elements decorated with geometric designs, the jewelry that carried family history all taken away, replaced with plain Egyptian linen. Simple white pleated garments worn by servants throughout the kingdom. Their hair was cut. the elaborate braids decorated with beads and metal ornaments that Libyan women wore were hacked off, restyled in simpler Egyptian fashion that required less maintenance and marked them visibly as no longer Libyan. Then came the renaming ceremony. A priest assigned each woman an Egyptian name that would replace her birth name in all official records. The names were often cruelly ironic. Hennetai, Lady of the Two Lands, for a woman who had just lost her only land. Nefertari, Beautiful Companion, for a girl torn from her family. The renaming was formal, recorded by scribes, legally permanent. Their old identities were being administratively erased. Daily life in the Medinet Habu Konarat followed rigid, monotonous routines. Women woke at dawn to begin their assigned work. Most labored at looms, weaving fine linen for temple use and foreign trade. Others worked in food preparation, grinding grain for hours until their hands bled, kneading endless batches of bread dough, brewing beer in massive quantities. The work was mandatory, physically exhausting, and performed under constant supervision. Women who slowed down or made mistakes faced immediate punishment, ranging from reduced food rations to beatings administered by the overseer. The Konarat overseer was usually an older Egyptian woman who had spent her life running such institutions, enforcing discipline through calculated cruelty and occasional mercy. She relied on rewards and punishments. Compliant women, those who worked hard, learned Egyptian, avoided trouble, received slightly better food, quarters, and tasks. Those who resisted, clung to native languages, or tried to preserve foreign customs faced physical punishment, transfer to harsher labor camps, or separation from their children. Most women learn to appear obedient, but outward compliance is not the same as inner surrender. Some secretly preserve fragments of identity in places surveillance could not reach. Evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina shows foreign workers writing in multiple languages on ostraca, hinting that similar practices occurred at Medinet Habu. Women could write their own languages in hieratic, whisper Libyan to their children at night, or pass on lullabies and stories that protected who they had been before captivity. This resistance was desperately dangerous. Being caught speaking Libyan, teaching it to children, preserving any element of their supposedly erased culture, punishment would be immediate and severe. But for some women, the alternative was worse: complete erasure of identity, letting their culture die without even attempting to preserve some fragment. They would rather risk beating than surrender that last piece of themselves. The children born in the Konarat complicated everything in ways Egyptian ideology struggled to accommodate. Hennetai bore her first child approximately 2 years after arriving at Medinet Habu. The father's identity wasn't recorded because it didn't legally matter. It could have been Ramesses III during one of his periodic visits. It could have been a high-ranking priest granted access rights as reward for loyal service. It could have been an administrative official. The papyri don't specify paternity. What mattered in Egyptian law was that the child belonged to the temple estate property, just like the mother. Her daughter faced a different trajectory. By her 3rd year in the Konarat, she was 16 or 17, considered fully adult by ancient standards. Young women raised in the Konarat were particularly valuable to the system because they could be molded almost completely, having fewer memories of alternative identities than women captured as adults. She was selected for what texts euphemistically call sacred service, work that combined household duties with sexual availability for priests and officials. This was framed through elaborate religious ideology as serving the gods, as if it were voluntary religious devotion rather than coerced exploitation. The reality was that she had no choice, no agency, and her service primarily benefited human men who used religious language to justify sexual access to captive women. She bore her first child at 17. Over the following 8 years, she would bear 3 more, all registered as temple property, all without legally acknowledged fathers. The children were raised partially by their mothers when work schedules permitted, but primarily through the Konarat's collective childcare system overseen by older women past childbearing age. These children existed in an ambiguous legal and social category that Egyptian society genuinely struggled to define. They weren't free. They belonged to temples or royal estates as surely as cattle or land. But they were also biologically connected to Egypt's religious and administrative elite, the priests and officials who had fathered them. Some showed obvious physical characteristics that mixed Egyptian and foreign traits, lighter or darker skin, different facial features, hair textures that didn't fit Egyptian norms, creating visible evidence of population mixing that complicated Egypt's ideological insistence on the superiority and purity of Egyptian bloodlines. Ramesses III displayed these children regularly in public ceremonies designed to demonstrate that Egypt didn't just defeat enemies militarily, but absorbed them culturally, transformed them completely. The Medinet Habu reliefs include scenes showing the pharaoh standing before long lines of children, described in accompanying inscriptions as born from captive women of the foreign lands. The children wear Egyptian clothing. Their heads are shaved in proper Egyptian style, except for the distinctive sidelock worn by Egyptian youth. They're presented as living proof that even children of defeated enemies could be made Egyptian through proper training and religious upbringing. One inscription describes them as pure ones without stain, born of the captives brought from foreign lands, now serving in the house of Ammon. The language reveals profound anxiety. The children are described as pure, despite their foreign ancestry purity, conferred not by blood, but by service to Egyptian gods and upbringing in Egyptian culture. But the very fact that the inscription emphasizes their purity suggests that debate existed within Egyptian society about their status. Were they truly Egyptian? Were they foreign? Were they something in between that Egyptian categories couldn't properly accommodate? In year 31 of Ramesses III's reign, a conspiracy emerged within the royal household that would become known as the Harem Conspiracy, documented in remarkable detail in the judicial papyrus of Turin. A woman named Taiwan of Ramesses III's minor wives wanted her son to become pharaoh instead of the officially designated successor. She recruited dozens of co-conspirators, including other women from the Kanarat, palace officials, military officers, and priests. The conspiracy involved what Egyptian texts call magic, probably poison or other methods of harm that Egyptians attributed to supernatural causes. They crafted wax figures. They obtained forbidden magical texts. They planned to kill the pharaoh and install Tai's son on the throne. The conspiracy was detected before it could fully succeed, though exactly how remains unclear from the surviving records. The conspirators were arrested and subjected to formal trial. Tai and several others were executed. Her son was forced to commit suicide. Dozens more faced severe punishment. The harem conspiracy reveals something crucial: women in these institutions weren't entirely without agency, despite their captivity and exploitation. They had access to resources, information, and networks of people who could be recruited to ambitious plans. The Kanarat were sites of political activity and intrigue, not just passive exploitation. And while we cannot prove direct involvement, it's worth considering that captive foreign women might have participated. Women who had watched their families destroyed, their identities systematically erased, who might have viewed conspiracy against the pharaoh as justified revenge, or at least a chance to seize some fragment of control over their powerless lives. Ramesses III died in year 32 of his reign, 1155 BCE, around age 61. Whether he succumbed to natural causes or to wounds from the assassination attempt remains debated, though his mummy shows a fatal throat cut, suggesting the conspiracy partly succeeded. After his death, the Medinet Habu Kanaret continued, but with shrinking resources as Egypt declined. By the 21st dynasty, it was likely closed or reduced to a token staff. What became of the captive Libyan women is unknown. Some died there, some were freed when upkeep grew impossible, and some or their descendants likely blended into Egyptian families as social boundaries weakened. Their genetic legacy persisted even when their names vanished. Modern studies show New Kingdom Egypt was more diverse than often assumed. with population links to Libyan, Nubian, and other North African groups consistent with centuries of captive-taking. Many modern Egyptians, especially near the western border, still carry genetic markers connected to ancient Libyan populations. Ramesses III's celebrated conquests created permanent demographic change. Cultural traces may also survive. Some customs in Western Egypt's songs, stories, wedding practices, ritual forms do not align with mainstream Egyptian patterns and may preserve elements of ancient Libyan traditions. Direct links to the women taken under Ramesses III can't be proven after 3 millennia. But cultural memory often outlasts institutions meant to erase it. Medina Tabu still stands, its reliefs showing bound women paraded before the pharaoh. Tourists rarely grasp that these were real captives, simulated, exploited, and used as labor and reproductive resources. Their names, like Henatai's and her daughters, are lost. But women exactly like them lived through these systems, resisting in small, hidden ways. Their story reveals how power masks exploitation behind monuments and rhetoric. Yet traces endure in DNA, in blended burials, in cultural fragments older than memory-quiet evidence that they lived, suffered, resisted, and refused to disappear.